Against all odds, a Harvard neurosurgeon, given up for dead, awakens after 7 days.
On the morning of November 10th, 2008, a 54-year-old neurosurgeon in Lynchburg, Virginia, woke up with a severe headache. This was unusual for him. In more than 25 years of practicing brain surgery, he had never been seriously ill. He was athletic. He was disciplined. He maintained the kind of physical regimen that a man who operates on human brains for a living understands is not optional. But this morning was different. The pain was deep. It radiated through his lower back and up through his skull. Within minutes, he was in agony. His wife found him on the bed, writhing, unable to speak in full sentences. She called an ambulance. His name was Eben Alexander III. He was born on December 11th, 1953. He had been adopted as an infant and raised in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, by a family deeply rooted in the sciences. His adoptive father was a prominent neurosurgeon. His path into medicine was not so much chosen as inherited. He attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, then Duke University School of Medicine, then completed his residency and fellowship at some of the most competitive neurosurgical programs in the country. For 15 years, he served on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. He worked at Brigham and Women's Hospital, the Children's Hospital, and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, all in Boston. He performed over 4,000 brain surgeries during his career. He published extensively in peer-reviewed journals. He trained the next generation of neurosurgeons. He was, by any measure, one of the most accomplished brain scientists in the United States. And he was a materialist, not in the colloquial sense of the word, in the philosophical sense. Eben Alexander believed, as the vast majority of neuroscientists believe, that consciousness is entirely a product of the physical brain. When neurons fire, consciousness arises. When neurons stop firing, consciousness ends. There is no soul. There is no afterlife. There is no ghost in the machine. The brain produces the mind the way the liver produces bile. When the organ fails, its product ceases to exist. He had heard patients describe near-death experiences. They had told him about tunnels of light, about deceased relatives greeting them, about feelings of profound peace and unconditional love. He had listened politely, and he had dismissed every single account. He knew from his training and from decades of clinical practice that these experiences were produced by a brain under extreme physiological stress, oxygen deprivation, carbon dioxide buildup, random firing of neurons in the visual cortex, endorphin release. The explanations were well established, well documented, and, to a neurosurgeon of his stature, completely sufficient. Near-death experiences were hallucinations. End of discussion. That was his position on the morning of November 10th, 2008, when the ambulance carried him to the Lynchburg General Hospital emergency room. By the time he arrived, he had lost the ability to speak. His body was convulsing. His eyes were rolling back. The attending physicians ran blood work and a lumbar puncture, and the results came back with a diagnosis that was almost unheard of. Eben Alexander had contracted spontaneous Escherichia coli bacterial meningitis. Coli meningitis in adults is extraordinarily rare. It occurs in fewer than 1 in 10 million people per year in the United States. The bacteria had attacked his brain's meninges, the protective membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord, and was rapidly spreading into the brain tissue itself. Within hours, his entire neocortex, the outer layer of the brain responsible for all higher functions, including thought, language, logic, memory, sensory processing, and conscious awareness, was under siege. By that evening, Eben Alexander was in a deep coma. He was placed on a ventilator. His doctors performed repeated CT scans and neurological assessments over the following days. The results were devastating. His neocortex was not merely impaired, it had effectively shut down. The bacteria had caused massive inflammation and the accumulation of pus across the surface of his brain. The part of the organ that makes a human being conscious, that distinguishes a person from a vegetable, was non-functional. His physicians, many of whom were his personal friends and colleagues, understood what this meant. At best, they gave him a 10% chance of survival, and even that number was generous. Over the next several days, as his condition failed to improve, the prognosis was revised downward to approximately 2%, and his doctors made it clear that even if he survived, the most likely outcome was that he would spend the remainder of his life in a persistent vegetative state, unable to think, speak, recognize his family, or form a coherent thought. For 7 days, Eben Alexander lay in that coma. His body was kept alive by machines. His brain, the organ he had spent his entire career studying and operating on, was confirmed to be offline. There was no detectable higher cortical function. By every standard of modern neuroscience, by every criterion that Eben Alexander himself had spent 25 years teaching to his students and applying to his patients, he was not conscious. He could not be conscious. There was no functioning hardware to generate consciousness. And yet, during those 7 days, Eben Alexander had the most vivid, most detailed, most real experience of his entire life. Not a hallucination. Not a fragmented dream. Not a confused sequence of random images. A coherent, sustained, overwhelmingly real journey through realms of existence that he had never imagined, and that his training had told him could not possibly exist. It began in darkness. He described it later as a kind of primordial murk, a realm that felt like being underground, like being submerged in something thick and suffocating. He had no memory of who he was. He had no sense of his own identity. He had no language. He had no framework for understanding what was happening to him. He was simply aware, present in a formless space that had no reference points and no apparent meaning. He would later call this place the realm of the earthworm's eye view. It was not frightening exactly, but it was deeply disorienting. He existed there for what felt like a very long time. And then, something changed. A light appeared. It was not the white light of popular near-death accounts. Not at first. It was a spinning, white gold light accompanied by a melody. The melody was not like any music he had ever heard. It was living. It was not something that existed outside of him. It was something that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and that carried with it a kind of understanding, a transmission of meaning that bypassed language entirely. As the light and the melody intensified, the dark realm cracked open, and he found himself rising into an entirely different world. He described this world in terms that strained the limits of human language. The colours were more vivid than any colours he had ever seen on Earth. Not brighter, exactly. More real. More saturated with meaning and depth. There were trees, fields, rivers and waterfalls, but they were not quite like anything on Earth. They seemed to be composed of a kind of living light. The landscape was populated by beings, people, but not exactly people. They were joyful. They were celebrating. They were dancing. And the atmosphere was pervaded by a quality that he struggled for years to adequately describe. It was love. But not love as he had known it. Not romantic love. Not familial love. Not the love that one human being feels for another within the normal range of human emotion. It was something vastly larger, something unconditional and absolute. Something that felt like the very substance from which the reality around him was made. And there was a companion, a young woman. She rode beside him on what he described as the wing of a butterfly. She was extraordinarily beautiful, with high cheekbones and deep blue eyes. She did not speak to him in words, at least not in any language he recognized, but she communicated with him directly, transmitting understanding into his awareness without the need for speech. The message she conveyed was simple and overwhelming. You are loved and cherished, dearly, forever. You have nothing to fear. There is nothing you can do wrong. He did not know who this woman was. He had never seen her before. He had no memory of his earthly life during this experience. He did not know his own name. He did not know he was a doctor. He did not know he had a family. All of that was gone. What remained was pure consciousness, stripped of every biographical detail, every habit, every assumption, every identity. And that pure consciousness was having the most profound experience it had ever had. From the realm of the butterfly wing, Alexander described ascending further into what he called the core. This was a place of infinite darkness, but not the darkness of the earlier murky realm. This was a darkness that was somehow full, warm, and infinitely present. It was the darkness of the void before creation, a space that contained everything and nothing simultaneously. And in that space, he encountered what he could only describe as a divine presence. Not a figure, not a face, not a man on a throne. An infinite, omniscient awareness that was the source of everything he had experienced. He felt that this presence knew him completely, far more deeply than he had ever known himself. And the communication he received from this presence was not informational in the conventional sense. It was more like being immersed in a field of total knowing, where understanding came not in sequential thoughts, but in simultaneous, all-encompassing bursts. He went back and forth between these realms multiple times during the 7 days of his coma. Each time he returned to the murky darkness, the melody and the spinning light would retrieve him and bring him back up. The experience was not linear. Time, as he understood it, did not function in these places the way it functions in ordinary waking life. Events seemed to happen simultaneously, or in patterns that defied any chronological ordering. On the 7th day, his 10-year-old son Bond climbed into the hospital bed and said the words that his family believes pulled him back. Eben Alexander opened his eyes. His first words were incomprehensible. His doctors expected catastrophic neurological damage. They expected the worst. What happened instead was medically impossible. Over the next several weeks, Eben Alexander made a complete neurological recovery. Not a partial recovery. Not a recovery with significant deficits. A full 100% restoration of all cognitive, motor, and sensory function. His case was later documented in a peer-reviewed paper, published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease by researchers at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. The paper confirmed the severity of his illness, the extent of his neocortical damage, and the completeness of his recovery. It described his case as one of the most remarkable in the medical literature on coli meningitis. When Alexander recovered sufficiently to begin processing what had happened to him, he did what any scientist would do. He attempted to explain it. He went through every known neurological mechanism that could have produced the experience. He considered the possibility of a residual cortical function that the monitoring equipment had failed to detect. He considered the possibility that the experience was generated during the brief period of recovery as his cortex came back online, a phenomenon known as ICU psychosis or emergence delirium. He considered the possibility of abnormal activity in the brainstem, the thalamus, or the basal ganglia, structures deeper than the neocortex that might have retained some function. He considered the possibility that endogenous DMT release had generated a hallucinatory experience. He systematically ruled out every one of these explanations. The bacterial meningitis had attacked the neocortex specifically and comprehensively. The CT scans and clinical examinations confirmed that his neocortex was not merely suppressed, but devastated. The experience he had was not fragmented, confused, or dreamlike in the way that ICU psychosis or delirium produces. It was, by his own assessment, hyper-real, more vivid and coherent than any experience of ordinary waking consciousness. The explanation that the experience was generated by a dying brain collapsed under the weight of the clinical evidence. He wrote about this process in detail because he understood, better than almost anyone alive, what it would mean if he could not explain the experience through conventional neuroscience. It would mean that his entire career, his entire intellectual framework, his entire understanding of the relationship between brain and mind was fundamentally wrong. It would mean that consciousness is not produced by the brain. It would mean that the brain is not a generator of consciousness but a filter, a reducing valve that constrains consciousness and confines it to the physical dimension. And it would mean that when that filter is damaged or destroyed, consciousness does not disappear. It expands. That is exactly the conclusion he reached, and he published it. His book, Proof of Heaven, A Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Afterlife, was released in October of 2012. Newsweek magazine put it on its cover. The book debuted at number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It remained on that list for 97 weeks. It has been translated into over 40 languages. It became one of the most widely read books about consciousness and the afterlife in American publishing history. The response was explosive. The scientific establishment pushed back hard. Skeptics pointed to inconsistencies. An investigative article in Esquire magazine in 2013 raised questions about Alexander's professional history, including previous malpractice claims and issues with his medical record keeping. Alexander and his supporters responded to these criticisms in detail, and a subsequent peer-reviewed analysis, published in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, argued that the Esquire article had distorted the facts. But the criticism, however intense, could not erase the clinical reality. The E. coli meningitis was real. The coma was real. The neocortical shutdown was documented in real time by real physicians using real diagnostic equipment. The recovery was real and was confirmed by neurological examination. And the experience, whatever its ultimate explanation, was coherent, detailed, and transformative in ways that no conventional neurological model could adequately account for. And then something happened that elevated the story from remarkable to extraordinary. Months after his recovery, Alexander began the process of reconnecting with his biological family. He had been adopted at birth and had only limited contact with his birth relatives. During this process, he was given a photograph of his biological sister, a woman named Betsy, who had died years before Alexander's illness. He had never met her. He had never seen a picture of her. He had no conscious knowledge of what she looked like. When he saw the photograph, he recognized her instantly. The woman in the picture was the companion on the butterfly wing. The young woman with the high cheekbones and the deep blue eyes who had ridden beside him and communicated the message that he was loved and cherished. It was his biological sister, a woman he had never met in life. A woman whose face he could not possibly have stored in any memory bank because he had never been exposed to her image. And yet, during the 7 days when his neocortex was confirmed to be non-functional, his consciousness had encountered her in a realm that, according to everything he had been taught, did not exist. This detail is the one that makes the case uniquely difficult to dismiss. A hallucinating brain can generate images from stored memories. It can remix faces, voices, and scenes that the person has previously experienced, but it cannot generate the accurate image of a specific individual whom the person has never seen. The identification of Betsy as the butterfly wing companion introduces a verifiable, external data point into what would otherwise be an entirely subjective account. Alexander did not know what his sister looked like. He later recognized her from a photograph. The match was unmistakable. The broader scientific context has only strengthened Alexander's case in the years since his book was published. Dr. Sam Parnia's AWARE 2 study at New York University, published in 2023, demonstrated that nearly 40% of cardiac arrest survivors who could be interviewed reported lucid, conscious experiences during the period when their hearts had stopped and their brains showed no electrical activity. Researchers at the University of Michigan detected organized gamma-wave surges in the brains of patients at the moment of death, patterns of activity associated with the highest levels of conscious awareness. And in early 2026, a comprehensive review confirmed that approximately 20% of cardiac arrest survivors recalled conscious experiences during clinical death, with evidence suggesting that brain activity may persist for minutes to hours after the heart stops. These studies do not prove Eben Alexander's specific interpretation of his experience. They do not prove the existence of heaven, a divine presence, or the survival of the soul. But they do something arguably more important. They prove that the standard materialist explanation, the explanation that near-death experiences are hallucinations generated by a dying brain, is inadequate. They prove that consciousness persists in circumstances where, according to the prevailing model, it should not. They prove that the relationship between brain and consciousness is far more complex, far more mysterious, and far more consequential than the mainstream scientific community has been willing to acknowledge. Eben Alexander did not set out to become a public advocate for the afterlife. He did not want to become a figure of controversy. He was a neurosurgeon. He liked operating on brains. He liked teaching medical students. He liked the clean, rational framework of materialist neuroscience. But the evidence of his own experience, evaluated with the same rigor he had applied to thousands of surgical cases, left him no choice. The data did not fit the model. And when the data does not fit the model, a real scientist does not discard the data. A real scientist revises the model. His revised model is this. The brain does not produce consciousness. The brain receives consciousness, filters it, reduces it, and translates it into the narrow band of experience that we call ordinary waking life. When the filter is removed, whether by death, by deep coma, by meditation, or by other means, consciousness is not extinguished. It is liberated. It returns to its natural state, which is unbounded, interconnected, and saturated with a love and intelligence that defies human description. This is what a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon, a man who performed 4,000 brain surgeries, a man who spent 25 years teaching medical students that the brain produces the mind, concluded after 7 days in a coma from which he should not have returned. He did not come to this conclusion because he wanted to. He came to it because the evidence demanded it. The debate over near-death experiences is no longer a debate between believers and skeptics. It is a debate within science itself, between those who insist that consciousness must be reducible to brain chemistry, and those who argue that the evidence has already outgrown that framework. The AWARE studies, the gamma-wave research, the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, and the detailed clinical documentation of cases like Eben Alexander's are not fringe science. They are published in mainstream peer-reviewed medical journals. They are conducted at the most prestigious research institutions in the United States, and they are producing results that the materialist model of consciousness simply cannot explain. Eben Alexander's story matters because of who he was before it happened. He was not a man predisposed to believe. He was not searching for spiritual meaning. He was not open to the possibility of an afterlife. He was the opposite of all those things. He was a hardened materialist, a product of the most rigorous scientific training that America offers. A man who had built his entire career on the assumption that the brain is the sole source of the mind, and the universe reached through his neocortex, shut it down completely, and showed him something that shattered every assumption he had ever held. The question that remains is not whether his experience was real to him. Of course it was. The question is whether the materialist model of consciousness, the model that says the brain produces the mind and death ends awareness forever, can survive the accumulating weight of evidence that says otherwise. The aware data says it cannot. The gamma wave data says it cannot. The clinical documentation of Eben Alexander's impossible recovery says it cannot. And the photograph of a dead sister, recognized by a man who had never seen her face, says it cannot. Something is happening at the boundary between life and death. Something that the most advanced instruments and the most rigorous research methods in the world are beginning to detect. Something that a neurosurgeon from Harvard experienced firsthand in a coma that should have killed him. The afterlife is no longer a matter of faith alone. It is becoming a matter of evidence. And it was an American surgeon, trained at American institutions, operating on American patients, who brought that evidence into the light.